In this tutorial, we will use 4 simple steps to create an impressive graphical abstract in Adobe Illustrator. Step 1 will be to download the free templates from Simplified Science Publishing using the links in the description box or course description. Step 2 is to choose a graphical abstract template. Step 3 is to add designs and data to the template. And step 4 will be to export our graphical abstract for the scientific publication and presentation. So let's start with step 1, where you can go to the YouTube description box to go to this Simplified Science Publishing link to free graphical abstracts. And you can see that this gives you the option to add a free graphical abstract template to your bag, check out very briefly, email you these templates, and that's a great, easy way to get these free templates. Or if you've signed up for online courses through the Simplified Science Publishing dashboards, you can see that you have a link to these free graphical abstract templates and can also download them directly from your dashboard in the Simplified Science course and templates profile. And by downloading these templates, you can see that if you've opened up the Adobe Illustrator version, that you now have access to 24 graphical abstract artboards, and each of these allow you to create designs for any purpose with one panel design to 2, 3, and multiple panel designs, as well as unique designs such as timelines and Venn diagrams. With the templates open, the next step is to choose which one of these templates best matches your own graphical abstract goals. If you aren't sure what format you want, I recommend that you draft your ideas on paper to see how many panels you will need. For example, if you have only one main concept that you want to show, that might be a one-panel design where the main large illustration is most of the graphical abstract and minor amounts of text above or below to the side of the abstract. Or you may have multiple concepts that you want to represent in multiple panels, and you may want to look at those different panels to decide. If you aren't sure what you want, you can draft on paper your design and see how many sections or what kind of graphical abstract design might best suit your needs. And for today's tutorial, I'm going to use a fake example, and I'm going to just mimic a brainstorm where I want to create a graphical abstract that shows the impact of medication on immune responses in patients. And so again, this is fake data, but let's say I decide in my brainstorm that I want to have one section that shows separating patients into the disease stages or endotypes, a second section that shows the different types of patient treatment they receive, and then a third section that shows the patient immune response to the treatments. So this is obviously going to need 3 sections. And if I go back to my 3-panel design, that's the place I want to look in my Adobe Illustrator template to choose what best represents the 3 sections. Part of me wants to go with this very simple description on the bottom, image on the top example, but I kind of want to make it fancier than this. I think this is a good starting point, but I'm leaning toward something that shows the 3 parts in a more complex way. So I'm going to use this graphical abstract example on Artboard 11 to begin to draft my illustrations and data. So with this artboard selected, my next step will be to create a new file so that I don't work or edit my template file. So I will go to File, I will go to New, and I could just save this file and work directly in it, but I'm actually going to start a new file. I'm going to open a web that has high resolution, make sure everything is a high resolution file, and press Create. And then I'm going to not use the default artboard because the default artboard has pixels as the properties, and if I use Command R or Control R, if I'm on a PC, I want to change this to millimeters and show you that this web artboard is much, much bigger than the maximum width of a typical publication max width, which is around 180 millimeters. And so I could adjust the artboard that exists here, but what I will do is I'm just going to go back to my template, have my artboard tool selected, select my artboard of choice, this number 11, press copy and paste, and now you can see side by side, this is 180 millimeter width artboard, so already set for a 2-column width scientific publication figure. And I can just click on this first artboard, delete it, and use this selection tool with the shortcut V if I want to then click in, zoom in using Command plus, that's Control if you're on a PC Windows. And I'm now ready to work on my new artboard that isn't saved yet. So again, a final step, I am going to save this file. I'm going to label this Graphical Abstract Example. I want to make sure I save it in a logical folder. For me, this is my logical folder as an Adobe Illustrator file, and press save. And keep all of the standard settings intact. And now we're ready to begin bringing that brainstorm to life in this template. We are now in step 3 of the design process, where we need to add the illustrations and data. I recommend using a mix of 3 methods for this. Method 1 is to download customizable images and template designs that have appropriate copyright rules. Method 2 is to draw your own illustrations. And method 3 is to import and optimize graphs from software such as Excel, GraphPad Prism, and others. We are going to go through examples of each one of these as part of today's tutorial, starting with how to download customizable images. To find customizable images, you can search for and download relevant images from the internet as long as they have copyright rules that allow you to use them for your designs. And I do recommend looking up vector drawings. This is going to make sure that you can download files and purchase files that are editable in Adobe Illustrator, so you can fully customize your graphical abstract. And right now we're showing a bunch of blood test vector drawings from Google Images. And there's lots of places where you can buy images that are often a little cheesy. So I also recommend looking up scientific databases, such as those at Simplified Science Publishing. And for today's tutorial, I am going to use templates from Simplified Science Publishing. I'm going to use this lab tools and equipment bundle that I've already purchased and downloaded that has a lot of the individual illustrations that I'm going to want to use in this graphical abstract. So if I go to my downloads and I open my laboratory tools and equipment AI file, this is the file that I get by purchasing that bundle and all the individual illustrations you see here, such as those I might use for a blood test, as well as different molecular assays that I want to illustrate as part of my graphical abstract. And again, this is not the only place you can get downloads. You can get downloads from a variety of databases online. Just make sure that they have the copyright rules that allow you to use it without attribution, and you may not want to subscribe to something, so having individual downloads can always be a great idea. After downloading the images, the next step is to add them to your graphical abstract file. And if they are in an Adobe Illustrator file, such as the one shown here, you can actually just begin to use your selection tool and copy, Command C, paste, Command V, and that's going to be using Control if you're on a Windows PC. And you can just begin to copy and paste the relevant images that you want to be customizing for this design. I know I'm going to want an IV bag, a simple IV bag. I know I'm going to want some blood test illustrations. So I'm going to take some of these test tubes. And that's very easy if you're using this sort of Adobe Illustrator template file, but it's also very easy if you've downloaded SVG files. So I'll show you an example there where, let's say you have downloaded multiple vector SVG files, and the way you want to add them is you can just take something like a symbol, a man symbol, and have your template open and your SVG file open and drag and drop. And you'll see that it'll open the SVG file for you to just copy and paste. So open your SVG files that way. It just opens it in its own individual artboard. So that's a great way to move assets here. Just realize that SVG files will copy and paste here without grouping. So you can see this man has lost his head. If I zoom in by using Command plus Control if you're on a PC Windows, you'll want to group some of these SVG illustrations for editing, just so that you, as you begin to move them around on your artboard, you don't lose some of their size and design when they're combined. After adding the images, the next step you want to take is to customize the text, sizes, and color of the graphical abstract designs. So let's start with the text. I'm going to take the graphical abstract background, and if you can see, this is in one grouped layer. For this initial rearrangement, I'm going to ungroup the layer using Command-Shift-G. So I just ungrouped that layer. And I'm going to start to work with the text, ungrouping sections that are grouped and making sure that as I select each element, I want them on the bottom. I can select with holding Shift and select all three of these top elements, drag them to the bottom, and I can take these two colors, I can drag them to the top, and I'm not too worried when things go above this graphical abstract line because they won't be exported in my final export, but I can also adjust that at the very end. And I'm just going to start to add in some of the text. So I'm going to click on this text element, double click, highlight, and then start typing to replace, so that this part 1 will read endotype analysis. So this is an important step in the study where they're going to separate the patients into different disease endotypes. Double click part 2, type patient treatment, type 3, type patient immune response. You can already see size-wise, I'm probably going to want this graph area to be a bit bigger, partly because of the text, but also partly because I want the graph to be a big portion of what this abstract focuses on. So what I can do is I can use my direct selection tool. I can highlight just the areas of the vector points. So these blue dots are now highlighted, and only these blue dot vector points, if I use the arrow key while holding Shift, I can tap them over once or twice. I'm going to do the same thing again on the other one with a direct selection tool, highlight just the points that I want to move, and hold Shift to tap them a little over, making more space for both this text and what will be a graph I will optimize from Excel. And we're looking pretty good. I could also, if I just felt like it, wanted to make these shapes directly touch the top of the graphical abstract, I can actually just select this shape, which is a light gray filled shape, and without anything else selected, if I select Align to Top, you'll see that it aligns to the artboard if nothing else is selected. So that ensures that the color is going all the way to the line and you're not confused by anything going over the line. So far we're looking good. I would say as I start to think about what to enter for these middle parts, I'm already regretting not having a larger title. Large titles at the top of a graphical abstract or at the bottom of the graphical abstract can really help your audience quickly understand how to make sense of all the details in between. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to template, and I'm going to go ahead and pull one of these titles, ungroup, select the title, and select that top blue box, copy, paste. And I'm going to group this, align to top and right of the artboard, and I'm going to want to probably increase the height of my artboard. So the artboard was designed with only 79 millimeters height. This height doesn't really have a max that's super standard. It's just the height of a page. If you want a full page figure, you rarely want a full page figure, but having it up to 100 millimeters or 90 millimeters is a good height to be working with, where you probably won't need much more than that for a typical graphical abstract to have it be 90 by 180 millimeters. So together this is looking pretty good. A few more adjustments I might make. I might want to center these arrows from left to right, pointing that it starts and is directional. So I'm going to hold Shift with the direct selection tool on. I'm going to select this point and then select this point. So only these two vector points are selected, and use my arrow key just to dot them up a little bit and move my patient details from the bottom up just a little bit so that we're firmly dealing with everything only within this artboard. And now this is looking like a really good background to start to put all the individual pieces inside. So let's add a title and start to fill this out. I'm going to double click this grouped title, double click again to then get this text box, and replace this text with a good summary sentence that describes what I'm trying to show below, which is that patients with two endotypes, so two different disease phenotypes essentially, show improved immune response with plasma infusions and a drug. And again, I'm making this up. So this is not a real drug. This is not a real experiment. But you can imagine that if there were a drug that's having an immune response reaction, this would be a good way to describe what you're going to see in the 3 panels below. And now I'm feeling quite good about these pieces. What I'm going to do as I start to add things to this backdrop is do one final group without any of these other illustration elements. I'm going to Command G, Control if you're on a PC Windows. And what I just did was I grouped all of this background. Sometimes I like to label my groups that are very important. For example, having this be the background. I can even sort of turn it off and on, and you can see that everything in this group can now be moved to the bottom of my layers panel, and I can even lock it so that as I pull things in and out, none of these pieces are editable. And I may want to edit it at the very end, but locking your background after you have a good background in place is a really great idea. And now, like I said, I'm ready to start adding some pieces. So there's going to be 2 things to show that there's patient history analysis and blood work analysis happening with a group of patients. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a bunch of the people symbol to represent a group of patients. So we'll start with them all being a gray color, but I'm probably going to want to represent them as a different set of colored patients that then get segmented into 2 different groups. And I'm going to use a series of groups. I'm going to group this set of 3 at the top. Make sure that they're evenly spaced between themselves. And then I'm going to align this group with this group so that they're all aligned. And I'm going to try to put a few other elements to show these patients are analyzed and first segmented by their clinical history. Now, to represent clinical history in a graphical abstract or a symbol on patients getting their clinical history, there are a few ways I could do this. I could use some of my copy-pasted images. For example, I could go and pull this sort of piece of paper which can represent clinical history. Or I want to also point out that there's that second method where I am in Adobe Illustrator and I don't have to use templates. I can also draw what I need. So in this example, I am going to show you how to draw a clinical clipboard symbol. And I'm going to start by using a shape that is not fully rounded. And this is going to represent the start of a clipboard that will represent patient history. So we have this rounded rectangle tool shape. I'm going to add another round rectangle to the top. And I'll even add a less rounded rectangle to the very top. Clipboards also typically have something at the top with a hole in them. So I'm going to take one shape and use a very bright color, center this, group them both by using the selection tool, use Shift M, and then use Option to delete part of that shape. And what you'll see is that this has now given a cropped out shape. And I may just want to pull in just these points. So I'm using Shift with the direct selection tool on to close that gap just a little bit on the top, the left, and the right. So again, using Shift while I click these individual points, using the direct selection tool, and just using my arrow keys to adjust where this gap exists. And together, this is creating a decent clipboard symbol. Now, a clipboard has the piece of paper in the center. And for this, I'm going to want no corners. I'm going to want it to be white. And this will represent that clipboard background where now I may want to have a little more information on this piece of white paper that signals this is a medical chart. One of the easiest medical symbols that exist is a cross. So I'm going to take two shapes. I'm going to make them a red color. And I believe I have the other shape over here. Use the I tool. I is the eyedropper shortcut. Rotate one of these by selecting it with selection tool. Shift to get the symbol for rotate on a corner. And holding Shift, I get 45-degree rotations. I can then Shift while I select these two shapes and center and group. So this is a medical chart clearly by the symbol, and I might just add some lines or shapes to signal that this is a medical chart with information. Let's go ahead and just make these a little longer. Doesn't have to be perfect, but groups of information, and I can group each of these groups of lines by holding Shift while I select them, Command G to group them, Control if you're on a PC. Now these groups, I want them to be evenly separated, so I'll use the even alignment, distribute them equally across the center, and I will make sure that all of these pieces are centered. And I think this is a bit bold to have it bright red, so I might just change the color of all of these shapes to be a dark gray. Perfect. Now I might add some text to make it a little more clear as to what is going on with these symbols. I'm going to go ahead and add a text box by selecting the Type tool. I'm going to go ahead and drag that text box in the area I want it to be, and I'm going to make this Arial because Arial and Helvetica are the most commonly used fonts for publication in scientific journals. I'm going to use 9-point font because that is also very standard internal text font size. And I'll go ahead and say this is called Patient Health Status and Clinical Historical Data. And so that will be sort of that first section of how they're going to determine the endotype of patients. Is they're going to look at the patient health status and initial clinical health data. And I would say then there is an arrow because after their initial clinical health status, I want to use the pen tool and have this be a stroke, not a fill. So I want the stroke to be a black stroke. I want the properties of this stroke to be 0.7 as far as the weight, and I want to click on this stroke symbol and add an arrowhead. I prefer arrowhead 7, and I usually put it at about 70%. And I want to show that these patients, after they're segmented by their initial health status and clinical historical data, I want to show that they then get a lot of blood work done to assess further what their proteomic genomic panels are like. So I'm going to go and take this blood work vial, and this sort of panel analysis symbol, pull them over to my design, hold Shift on these two that are too big, and size them down. And keep in mind, I'm scaling strokes and effects are on as well as scaling corners. This is important when you're sizing already formatted illustrations. If I didn't have scale strokes and effects on, you might get some weird line width sizes. So just keep in mind if you're getting funky things when you scale and hold Shift as you scale, to check whether in your properties you have this on or off. I'm going to also hold Shift and downsize this proteomic genomic panel. And what I'm already noticing is that maybe I want a little more space. So I can do one of two things. I can make this top part a little smaller, which I think I will do. I'll go ahead and hold, while V is selected, select these illustration elements, hold Shift to size them equally down, make a little more space at the top. I'm also going to make a little more space at the bottom by just expanding the height of my graphical abstract. Now you'll notice that I need to go back to my background and unlock it because I can't get those layers down without unlocking it, but I just did. I'm going to select and ungroup that background temporarily, not select anything else besides these three bottom sections, and pull them down. I'm going to pull the rest of this down with it behind, and I'm going to make sure that these are also pulled in. Whenever you're resizing a background, always pay close attention to any gaps, such as these tiny gaps, that may need some resizing and realigning to make it work. These points need to be readjusted again to be centered. And now we're looking good again with this background, so I'm going to select just these background elements, group them again, and lock them again. And keep in mind, sometimes your layers get missed. For example, this arrow got missed in that grouping. So I'll do it again while holding Shift, group. Now that background is locked and we're ready to keep working while adding more of the graphical abstract illustrations that we need on this file. And I'm just going to keep formatting this in a way that makes me happy, where these are at the top. I'm going to make sure this is grouped so I don't have to deal with clicking on all the elements all the time. Move this up a little bit. I'm going to want to maybe more clearly describe what is happening on this bottom piece, because it is an important part of the study, is this segmentation of which endotypes the patients are categorized as. So I'll add another text box here to describe that blood work and genomic, proteomic, and cellular panels are run as part of this endotype analysis. And if you see that little red box, that means that the text I've typed into this text box is overrun. So you can always resize the text box to make it make sense. And with a text box, I should also mention, if you're seeing the hyphen, that's by default. If you want to turn off hyphens, go to paragraph and turn off hyphenate. And now we're looking good. I'm going to make these a little smaller. I'm going to just point out that this blood work is done sequentially. So I'm going to copy paste this arrow, going to zoom in just so I can get a little closer and make sure that's how I can get this rotate symbol on the corner. Have this show that it's sequential. We do blood work and genomic panel analysis. I'll have these two aligned on the bottom. I'll have this arrow stand out, or even it doesn't even need an arrow. I'm actually going to remove an arrow here because all of this endotype analysis happens, and it doesn't have to necessarily happen in one specific order, but patients are analyzed, their blood work is analyzed, and they get segmented into two different endotypes for patient treatment. So if I move these guys over here, this next panel that I want to illustrate is that there will be two different types of patients with different disease stages. And I want to figure out how to represent this on this panel. And what I can easily do easiest is represent them with color. So I haven't talked about color design much. I'm just using the template colors that exist. But color is a very important way you can draw your eye and tell the scientific story from left to right. So as far as color design, I'm going to want to make these two endotypes. So there's going to be an endotype 1, and I'll have that right adjusted and take up less space in that text box, and an endotype 2 patient. They need to be colors that are easily distinguished from each other. And when I choose those colors, what I often do is I use my color palette template. And you can get this from the online store at Simplified Science Publishing separate. You can get it as part of the bundles. But this color palette template shows bright, dark, and background colors with everything pre-formatted as options. And these bright colors have been shown already to be good combinations for people with color blindness. So if you match this blue and this red together, or this blue, red, and teal together, or even all four of these colors together in a figure, you're not going to have color conflicts with people with color blindness. That's same with this bright blue, orange, and purple palette, this pink, green, and brown palette. And this is not something where you only have to use these pre-selected palettes. You can use any color you want, but just make sure that you're using a tool such as the color palette tool to test whether they are conflicting for people with color blindness. And know that if you want pre-selected colors, this is a great starting point. This is what I start with for all my designs and adjust it slightly from there to match whatever design needs I have. But I start here every time. So I'm going to copy this color palette template and bring it back to my abstract. And what you'll see is that from here I'll decide maybe to use a mix of the bright and dark colors. I'll probably end up choosing the blue and the red as my main two colors for my two endotypes, but I could also be choosing blue and teal if I felt like it, or this bright blue and orange, or an orange and a purple. So again, the choices are endless. Just be cognizant of using a minimal amount of color and the right color combinations to make it easy for your audience to understand. If I were to make every single one of these a different color, that would be a bit confusing. I want to keep it ideally to two main colors with accenting with grays if possible. Unless you have a massive data set, you rarely need more than 2 or 3 colors in a color palette. So let's go ahead and pull some of these colors out and start to play with what I think these two endotype colors should be represented as. And let's say for this red endotype, I could pull this bright red, and for this endotype 1, I could pull this bright blue, but it kind of conflicts with my top color that I've selected, and even conflicts a little with some of my pre-formatted illustrations. Sometimes it's nice to just mix the dark and bright palettes, or pull a slightly different blue that I also know will go well with the red. So again, you don't have to stick with only one pre-selected color. Right now, I think I like most that there's this dark blue and this brighter, but again, a little on the dark side red. So I think these two colors represent the endotypes well. And now I can go back to my group of people here, and I want to make sure I have each of these grouped with their heads, because I ungrouped them. It'll make it easier to just have them grouped when I decide their color palette. So now they're each grouped, and I'll have one represented with this blue, one represented with this red, and I'll have the others be a mix between the two, where if I click on this color guide panel, and if you don't see the color guide in your properties panel, know that you can always add it by going to Window and turning on the color guide. And the color guide, what this does is, once you have a shape selected with a color on what is based on the current color, you'll see this different shade and tint appear, as well as some other contrasting colors that go well with this selected color. And this is really helpful, especially in the darker shades and the lighter tints, when you want to add a series of colors that will look nice and be in the same color family, but won't be this exact same color. And this is similar to my color palette, where I could also just use the eyedropper tool and select some of the lighter colors from my color palette. But I thought this would be a great opportunity just to say that if you don't want to be using the color palettes, you can also be selecting your own colors and then selecting some of these tints as a way of Again, selecting a variety of different reds that go very well together but are contrasting enough that they don't look the same. I can do the same for the blue. If I select the blue shaped person and I select the color shown in the color guide, I can then select a lighter blue or a darker blue, whatever I need to show that this is a patient population being sorted into two different endotypes. So that looks good to me. I'm going to keep that color scheme, and I'm going to back out a little bit using Command minus and just take a quick look at some of my alignment. I want these 4 elements to be equally spaced. So I'll actually go to the Properties Align tool and distribute spacing equally. I'll also make sure that these arrows are perfectly aligned and centered with each other. And I'll move these to be more centered in their panel. I'll group this group of patients, move them over just a touch until this first panel is looking pretty well complete for showing how the endotype analysis works. Can move this down. Again, just using with the V, the selection tool on, shifting some of how these are aligned. And this is looking good. So I'm ready to move on to more of my patient treatment options for endotype 1 and endotype 2. And for this study that is made up, I'm going to say that they're being given plasma infusions with a drug X. So in this case, we're going to want to show that there's groups of these patients, and I'm going to have some of these endotype 1 patients being given plasma infusions with a drug and without a drug. So what I just did was I copied and pasted this arrow. I used my direct selection tool to then pull this one vector point, and for now I'll just point it up, and the up is going to be pointing toward this plasma bag. So this infusion is going to be represented by this infusion IV bag, and there's obviously some things about the color that don't quite work for this illustration. So I'm going to do some adjustments to this. First, I'm going to reduce the length of this part of the illustration by using A to get the direct selection tool, just selecting these bottom points and tapping them up with my arrow key. I'm also going to take and ungroup this illustration, and I'm going to want this blue color to be represented by a plasma color. And I'll just actually pull the same plasma color here just to see what it looks like. And it's a little dark for what I want. So it's a good starting point because it aligns with the yellow color scheme here. But I'll go ahead and change this pre-formatted gradient by selecting this shape that has the gradient, edit gradient. I'm going to then look at the 2 points. This is the point of the color represented on the left and the point of the color represented on the right. I'm going to want to brighten it up a little bit. So I can either do that by using the tools here to brighten it, or this is another place where it's helpful to have some color schemes that you like and or that you've used before. So this could be a really nice lighter color scheme for yellow. And so I'm going to pull this in and zoom in and say that let's test this gradient by selecting this left color using the color picker, and let's do a lighter color. So that lighter color, select this right color, so this selecting this side of the gradient, use the color picker and use this brighter color. So that pops a little bit more and looks much better. This needs to be a little darker on top to maintain the illusion of depth. So I may even then want to pull one more darker color up to this gradient. Edit gradient. Select this far right color on the top, color picker, and that gives a nice illustration of depth. And I might even make that a little lighter, and I'll show you how to use these tools. So if I wanted this to be lighter, I can also be adjusting the red, green, blue color scheme to represent a lighter but still depth color. So that looks good. I'm going to delete my squares there. And we're almost done with this bag, this IV fluid bag. What I want to do next is realize that this top part has a white background, but this backdrop is transparent. So it's not showing up as a white background. What I want to do is I want to add a white background to this to make it stand out and to make it consistent and separate from the background. So I'm going to copy and paste this, ungroup it using Shift Command G a bunch of times, and that separates this out so I can delete all these other individual elements where I just want to pull out this central shape. And instead of having an outline stroke, I'm going to swap and then replace that with a white background. And I'm going to, in this group of layers, I'm going to make sure that this is on top, the very top, and I could do that by dragging this group to the very top, or I could be using Command Shift and the right bracket to put it up top. And now you'll see that this white shape is behind it, and I can align it so that it's perfectly behind that outline, and I can add it to this group. So that is now a final complete illustration when I have a bluish background instead of a white background for this IV bag. And we're almost there. So I have the endotype 1 patient being treated with a plasma infusion, but I also want to show the other treatment where they're getting the medication. So I'm going to copy paste the bag, copy paste the arrow, hold Shift to drag it down, and I want this arrow to be the exact same angle but pointing downward. So I want to go to Properties and use this flip vertically, which you can also use in your object panel, transform. You can reflect and scale and use the transform object panel, but that's the shortcut in the properties panel. And hold Shift while I drag it down. I'm going to resize both of these, hold Shift so they're taking up a little less space. And this is looking pretty good. So I have 2 plasma bags. One is going to be labeled as the control. One is going to be labeled as drug X. And I'm going to need to represent this bag having the drug inside. So that next step is going to be adding a symbol here, and it can be any symbol really, but for now I'm going to go ahead and choose the star shape as a symbol. So if I use Shape Star Tool and just click on my workspace, I have the option to choose how many points the star has and the radius of the points. I would say a 5-point star is a typical star. And I'll go ahead and rotate it so that it falls on 2 points bottom, 3-ish points on top. And this looks pretty good. I'm going to minimize it, and I'm going to choose a color for the drug that's consistent with the rest of my color palette. For now, I will maybe even just pull a blue color from the title. So if I use the eyedropper tool and pull this blue, that will stand out from the yellow, because just as a hint, I know that blue and yellow can be a good pairing when I'm also using red. So it'll stand out from this background. And I'm trying to use some of the same consistent color scheme, even though I'm mixing some of the dark and bright colors. But again, try not to use too many colors because that becomes distracting. I'm not really trying to focus on the drug color. I just want it to stand out from this plasma bag background. And I'm going to just copy paste. There's Command C, Command V, or Control on a PC. There's also on Illustrator the neat trick of clicking Option, and just while holding Option, I can click and drag any of these objects and pull them as a copy to a new location, which is great. So that's what I'm doing here, is I'm just holding Option as I do this. I'll do some final configuration of what looks good to me for having the drug copy. And then also there's Command C, Command F. Command F or Control F on a PC creates a copy right on top of the other layer. So be careful with Command F. You can sometimes add a lot of copies when you're not realizing you are, because they're right on top of another layer. That's another copy paste trick in Illustrator. Okay, so lots of copy paste tricks to get us to a place where we're happy with the layout of the representation of a control and a drug treatment. I'm going to select all of these and group them, and I'm going to basically rinse and repeat. This Endotype 2 is going to have this same panel. So if I copy and paste and drag it down and even group this whole thing and align it to this arrow on the left, that ensures that I am aligning these things in a way that is consistent, because one of the easiest ways to look professional in your graphical abstract is to have even alignment, even spacing. It looks comfortable to the human eye when things are evenly spaced, so it's not something that you want to leave untouched. Make sure you have as much even spacing as possible. And that looks really great. I'm going to go ahead and bold the text here because it's important. This text I want to stand out. It's very important that these were separated into endotypes and that are then getting these treatments. Okay, the only other thing that I feel like I want to adjust now that I have the panel 2 more or less done is I still want to point out this is Endotype 1 and Endotype 2. They are different. So I'm going to go back to my layers that I have locked. I'm going to go all the way down to the bottom where I have this background layer, unlock it, and ungroup it to pull this panel into 2 different colors. One of the easiest ways to differentiate between panels is to choose 2 colors. So I'm going to use Command C, Command F, Control if you're on a Windows PC, and I now have another color shown here, and there's 2 shapes. What I want to do is I want to change the color of one of these shapes to be a slightly different shade of blue. And what I can do is I can use my color guide, select this shape, and pull a different tint that's maybe darker or lighter, but still not completely white. I can make this one a touch darker, and that's a bit too much. When it gets a bit too much, I can also just double click on my color picker and manually select where on this color map I want my color to go. Still a little dark. Let's lighten it up. I just want them different enough to show up, but still contrast with these arrow lines, which I've now centered. And that looks good. Now I very clearly have one section separate from the other section. These are perfectly aligned with these arrows, and we're ready to insert our patient immune response. For this example, I'm going to use the third method of adding designs and data, which is to optimize a graph from graphing software. And in this case, I'm going to use Excel. So this is a Excel line graph example where I'm using fake data for endotype 1 and 2 control and endotype 1 and 2 with a drug, and a fake immune response graph where these two graphs represent default line and plot graphs from Excel. And if I were to pull these directly into my graphical abstract, they would not look very professional. So there's a lot of work we can do within Excel to improve their design and match how they fit into our graphical abstract. And in fact, a lot of what we can do can be done directly in Excel. So if I scroll down, I want to show you that this is an example done entirely in Excel where I've optimized the graph to match the design and color scheme that is going to be used for a professional publication style. And I'm not going to go through every single setting, but I will go through all the settings that you can use to make a similar graph using this data. And you may not have the exact same version of Excel as I do, but keep in mind when I go through each of these settings and get the format menus, you will be able to see similar format menus that may not be exactly the same, but the same options will exist in a menu, even if it looks slightly different. So let's get started on adjusting this example graph. And I like to work from the outside in. So even just starting with this outline, I'm going to right click. I'm going to format chart area. So if you don't already see this menu, that will pop this menu up somewhere. And I'm going to remove the border. So no border for me. I'm going to work my way in. I'm going to change the font to Helvetica. I'm going to change this to be a much bigger axis size, Helvetica. I'm going to change the legend as well. And Helvetica or Arial will work well for scientific publications. I'll expand the size. And we're already looking a little better, or at least easier to read. But there's many more adjustments to be made, especially when it comes to the actual data itself. And what you'll notice is that by default, you do not get the option to add the error bars on Excel graphs. And if I add the standard deviation, I'm actually going to go below 0 on this axis. So knowing that, I'm going to use my mouse to right click, see the menu, format axis, and I'm going to change my minimum boundary to -10, which will move this to -10. And I want my horizontal axis cross to be moved from automatic to -10. So we've just expanded this to include a negative portion of the axis. And the next thing I'm going to do is left to right, I'm going to click on these grid lines. I'm going to right click, format grid lines, and the color is a dark gray. I prefer all grid lines to be fairly faint gray because I don't want them to distract from the most important information, which is the actual data points. Next, I'm going to select this first control group, and without even clicking, I have my format data series. If you don't see format data series, right click any element, whether it be the line or the symbol, and make sure that you can just format data series. And you want to see that you have the option to change the line, the marker. So marker, I don't want a border color. The line, I want to add a solid line. I want to change the color of this line. And when I'm doing controls and changing colors of controls, it's good to already have an idea of what colors you want to be using in your scientific figures and be consistent When it comes to using two controls, I'm just going to use this gray color palette, so light gray and a circle for endotype 1, and dark gray with the diamond for endotype 2 controls, right, where nothing is added. And then when it comes to endotype 1, still a circle with the drug, that's where I'll highlight the color shift. So if I want to keep this line a light color, light gray color, I'll choose 4 in. I'm going to change the width of this line to just 1 point, or maybe even just 2 points. And I'm going to change the marker to match that exact same 4th gray color. And I want the marker to be a little bit bigger. So instead of using automatic, I'm going to use built-in, and I don't want it to be the diamond. I actually want this to be the circle. So a built-in and a larger symbol. And you can see already, and that's maybe too big, 10. Already this line is looking so much better. And there's just a few other things that I want to do, which includes making sure that this marker doesn't have any shadows. For some reason, shadow is by default. Turn off any shadow presets to no shadow. And already you can see this line is so much improved from the original. And there's just a few more adjustments left. One final thing I also want to do is I want to add those error bars. Error bars can be a bit of a pain to find depending on which one, but you should be able to see a chart design menu pop up when you have a data set selected. You can click on chart design, add chart element, and again, you may be seeing slightly different places for these, add error bars, and have more error bars options. With more error bars options, you're going to see that annoyingly, they've already added default error bars horizontally, which we'll have to delete, but that's fine. We'll delete those after we add our real error bars, which require custom specify value, where we want to have for both the positive and the negative value, the standard deviation, and click OK. So these now have caps and are representing the standard deviation. You'll notice that there was still this automatic one put on before we could catch it. So you are going to have to select that. Just make sure you're clicking just that and press delete. Perfect. So getting closer, we now have error bars, but they're black error bars. To be consistent, I actually want to also change their color to the same color as the symbol. That will make it very easy for your audience's eye to keep all the right information with the right colors and designs. And rinse and repeat. The next ones that you do follow that exact same method, right? You go through, you remove shadows, you make sure that the marker is a marker that you want, that makes sense for your data. In this case, the endotype 2 are going to be diamonds. I don't want a border color, it just adds complication. I like to keep it simple. I do want a solid fill, and I want it to be darker, and I'll take it about 4 more shades darker. I want there to be a line, so a solid line connecting these. We'll have it be the 2-point width, same as the other, same color as the other. And again, this is just following just a few control-click options. I want chart design, add chart element, error bars, more error bar options. Sadly, they add them. Let's go to the format section and custom specify value. Add those standard deviations. Perfect. Getting closer. Go back. Change that to be the same color as the marker and delete the extra error bars. Now we're getting closer and closer to a good looking graph that can be ready for publication with a few additional adjustments. Here's where I want to point out that for these two colors that I'm showing here in this example, I can pull colors from any file by making sure that I am using the same colors and consistent themes, right? So the endotype 2 in my graphical abstract is this red color, endotype 1 is this blue color. When I want to change the color of symbols in either PowerPoint or in Excel, there's a very powerful tool that you should know about, which is called the eyedropper tool. So when I format this data series and I have this marker selected, let's say I wanted to switch it and I wanted endotype, I wanted this marker to be the blue color instead, I can click on the color, click more colors, select my eyedropper tool, and what you'll see is that this eyedropper is expanding the color of anything I hover over. So if I wanted it to be directly from my graphical abstract, this endotype blue, I can click on that as I hover, press OK, and it will actually bring that color into my Excel graph so that I can keep things consistent. I don't want to do that for this graph, but that is how I pulled this exact red and this exact blue into this Excel file. And that's exactly what you could do if you were optimizing this graph over here. Now, I'm not going to do these next two because it's using the exact same techniques I just showed you. But I do want to point out that how I got to this final looking figure was by adjusting some of the axes, moving this legend in a way where it made sense to me for where all my concentrations and gradients were. And I also didn't use the automated settings for axis labels. I actually added these two labels as separate text box. So these are by going to insert text, adding a text box, and adding the text box that is Helvetica. And from here, I can take this graph and take a screenshot of it to pull it in to anything such as a PowerPoint slide or anywhere that I'm formatting my figures. And the reason why I can take a screenshot of it is because there's this now white background over the cells. So I do want to show you this quick trip where, as you can see, by default, Excel has every cell have a white or a gray cell background. In order to change this, if I want to add text labels above and to the side and have it formatted where everything around this graph is white, what you can do is you can highlight the cells surrounding the graph you're formatting, go to Borders, Line Style, make sure that a style is selected, and make sure that the line color is changed to white, and click on the function box to get out. Go back and make sure that the selected cells had all borders. So all borders have now been added, where the borders have been designated with lines and white lines. So again, have a line selected, have the white selected, and then you can change these cell colors to a white background. And the point of this is, again, if you wanted to take a screenshot of this and put it directly into the figure, you could use Command-Shift-4 if you're on a Mac, or use the snipping tool if you're on a PC, and copy and paste this graph from the desktop and actually even just drag it into your image. Now, I could drag and drop the screenshotted PNG into this file, but what I want to show you as this power of Adobe Illustrator is that you can do a lot more than just use screenshots from graphing software such as Excel. If I wanted to put this graph into my file, I actually want to take the full graph data, use copy and paste, and group what I've pasted so that I can take this graph, delete these other elements that I don't need, and edit this graph directly in my file. So what I want to show you is that this group graph, if we look at the layers, there are a bunch of things called clip groups. It looks a little odd, but you want to remove those clip groups by selecting the graph that you pasted, going to Object, Clipping Mask, Release. And now, if you can see, all of those clip groups now became individual elements, individual numbers, individual paths, individual shapes. So now we can actually go to the work of editing this graph. And before we edit, I always like to say, go ahead and create a copy separate from the graph you're going to edit, because just in case, realize you now have editing capability over all these separate points. You can accidentally alter your data unethically if you're not careful. So I always recommend go ahead and keep one untouched graph to the side just to compare your before and after editing, just to be on the safe side so you don't accidentally adjust data when you don't mean to and to make it unethical. So we have one copy saved. Let's get to work. What I want to do with this is first I want to select just this graph data and get rid of everything else. So I've ungrouped all of these elements. I'm going to use V to select this corner, just this upper right hand corner, and I'm going to delete. What that did was it deleted some of the outside layers and it made it so that I can easily select just what I want in here, which are separate label, text elements, and shape elements. And this also allows me to then take this graph bit, group it, separate it from the legend, and pull it in here where I'll resize it while holding Shift so that everything maintains the same size. And I'll add this here. I will click on the font and realize that I chose Helvetica in my previous Excel example. I actually do want to change the font, and I can easily do that by using this trick of going to Select, Same, and Font Family. So if I want all Helvetica text to change, by selecting Same Font Family as that -10, I now have everything Helvetica, and I'm going to change it to Arial instead. So now this is changed to Arial text to keep things consistent. I'm going to add text to the bottom. I'm going to make the drug concentration shown here. And I'm going to bold it because I do think this is important information. I'm going to use text to say immune response. And I do prefer to add my labels, my axis labels in Illustrator, because these text elements actually become often unwieldy. They become separate individual text boxes instead of one text box. So I like working with text in Illustrator over the copy paste of Excel. And we're getting closer. This is looking really good. It's matching what I expect, but I do want to get this legend in here and formatted properly, where I'm going to take these top two, group them. Oh, and you can see I accidentally left behind a line. So it's also good to just zoom in, make sure you're grabbing everything you think you are. I'm going to grab this top bit, group it, grab this bottom bit, group it, zoom out, pull these to the left and these to the right. Align them to the top so that they're equally aligned. I might make them a little smaller so they don't stand out too much from all the other information. And now you can see I have inputted my Excel graph. It's perfectly formatted so that all of these symbols perfectly match endotype 2 and endotype 1. The most important data stands out from the controls, and this is now a very good looking graph that can move on to the final step, which is to export this information and use it in our publications and presentations. Before exporting, something I do like to do if I'm done is do a final cleanup where I delete all the extra things, such as the background. I will take one more look at my graph just to make sure everything seems like I didn't accidentally edit out or delete a line or a dot. Looks good. And I can adjust any final alignment things. I want these centered. I want the artboard size to be all the way to the edges. I want this to be a little bit lower. And this looks great. So again, this is step 4. The final step is exporting. And in order to export this, I have 2 recommendations. One is that if you're going to export for a manuscript, I recommend you go to File, Export As, and use the TIFF file and use the artboard setting, which in this case we just have the one graphical abstract artboard. And if you have multiple graphical abstracts, you may want to pick the graphical abstract number you want exported, but for now, all is fine. And by exporting this as a TIFF, you're exporting a high resolution file that can be submitted to a journal. So export, you can compress the image to make it a little smaller, make sure that the resolution is high, make sure that the color model is RGB. If you were going to send this to print instead, then you'd want to change it to CMYK, but RGB is what we want for almost every scientific publication requirement. So scientific publication, these are the settings, click OK, and you've now exported this TIFF file. If you want to export this for something like your slideshows or presentations, know that you can go to File, Export, Export As, and save it as a PNG instead. The PNG file is great for slides, and it's a high enough resolution, high enough, but not too high that it's such a large file that'll create too big of a PowerPoint file. So PNGs are what I recommend for PowerPoint. Export the file, choose white or transparent background, in this case a white background, because this panel I want to remain as a white background in this third panel, and high resolution, okay. And here's another tip I want to point out. Let's say you are giving a presentation or you're making a poster, but you don't want the graphical abstract elements to look exactly like this. You may want to represent each of these sections separately. And that's where in the same exact file where we have one graphical abstract artboard, keep in mind that you can conveniently copy and paste different sections so that if you wanted for some reason to represent the different sections or just paste one section, you can go through using the selection tool, copy, paste, group, and use some of these elements separately. So for example, you could have these separately exported, where this is now another artboard that you can label endotype analysis. You can label this one and have it be the exact same size. Let's see, the size of this artboard is 56.47 by 80. You can also just copy and paste this artboard and make sure that these are moved far enough to the right, but select the artboard, copy, paste again, and you can delete the information on there, pull in this other group. And again, don't worry if your artboard has some bits of the background that are not within this artboard line. When we export it, the only things that will come out with us is that which is in the export line. Just realized I left my endotype symbol behind in that group. Bringing it back. And I'll lastly move this graph, and I can go into my artboards. I now have 4 artboards on this file, and I can label them separately. And I could take them apart even further if I wanted to separate individual elements into something else. But these can now be separated as 3 separate panels to export if you wanted your presentation to have them show up on slides separately. You can use artboards all or just the range and export artboards 2 through 3 separately. You can label them something for slides differently. And know that these will now be exported as 3 separate files, separate from the full graphical abstract. The graphical abstract tutorial for Adobe Illustrator is now complete. Thanks for watching and have a great day.